It's quite a spectacular scene, even more so, I think, than most mountain scenery. Well, a climber in who the sensus divinitatis is operating may form very different beliefs than a climber in which the sensus divinitatis is not operating well. You know, an operating sensus divinitatis will cause the climber to experience the world differently than a climber in who the sensus divinitatis is not working well. And these two climbers will have very different views about how likely it is that God exists and that God is worthy of worship. But now, according to the probabilistic assumption, there's only one rational belief in this situation. So the probabilistic assumption, well, it says, look at this probability. Look at how likely it is that God exists, conditional on a description of looking down the east side of Denali at the Trilika Glacier. Now, presumably both naturalists and theists can agree on that description. And presumably then there would be a unique probability of God existing conditional on that evidence. The heart would play no role on that picture. On my proposal, we reject this probabilistic assumption. We don't look at that objective probability of God existing conditional on a description of looking down the Trilika. Even if that probability exists, it's not important at all for our epistemic project. Instead, we look at the climber's judgments, which have been affected by experience, by the operation or non-operation of the sensus divinitatis, and by their hearts, their wills, and their affections. We make probability judgments all the time in our ordinary lives, but we are no better off by postulating some sort of objective probabilities that are in some way supposed to ground these than we are by just viewing our judgments as personal judgments that are restricted by logic. Any reason you can give to convince me or someone that there's some objective probability out there and it has a certain value and that's epistemically relevant to what you should believe could just as easily be given to convince me to hold that certain belief. Nothing is gained by postulating these objective probabilities. However, one doesn't have to deny these objective probabilities exist to reject the probabilistic assumption. You know, some people, they may agree with the probabilistic assumption, or wait, you may agree with Plantinga's Aquinas Calvin model of religious belief, and yet also agree with the probabilistic assumption that the relevant probabilities are objective. Well, you could either say that your experience leads you to a better view of what the objective probabilities are, or you could simply say there's no close connection between those objective probabilities and what is rational to believe. Excuse me. For example, Plantinga has argued that the epistemic import of a description of the evidence might be very different from the import of the evidence itself. So conditionalizing on a description of looking down the Trilika Glacier is going to be very different than looking down the Trilika Glacier. So although Plantinga appears to believe that logical probabilities exist, he would reject the probability assumption because, according to him, non-propositional evidence is very important to what it's rational to believe. And these probabilities do not account for non-propositional evidence. On either of these ways of rejecting the probabilistic assumption, we see that what it is rational to believe depends on more than just these objective probabilities and a description of the evidence. And I should also comment, instead of belief in God, we could have picked lots of other topics, like external world and so forth. Wesley Salmon proposed, he wrote various criteria for assessing interpretations of probability. And he proposed that any acceptable interpretation of probability must both allow us to ascertain the relevant probability values, and they must be useful in managing our beliefs and in guiding our actions. The probabilistic assumption faces a problem with Salmon's criteria because there are no probabilities of the sort it requires that are epistemically relevant to what we should believe. One problem is that we have no means of determining what these probability values are. The most well-known version of logical probability is Carnap's theory, and the virtue of Carnap's theory was that you could ascertain the probability values. It was all calculated from facts about language. You know, hardly anybody today holds that theory, but people still hold that there's, you know, probabilities in objective logical relation, but it's not based on language. Well, I have no argument that no such relation exists. There may be one out there, but if there is, we don't have access to it in any principled way. We don't have any algorithm that allows us to ascertain these values. We're not required to know those values in order to be rational. But even if you could know those probabilities, they're not going to be useful in managing our beliefs. You know, according to the probability assumption, these objective probabilities are supposed to be very closely connected to what it's rational to believe. But knowing those values really has no implications for what it's rational to believe. You know, the problem is there's many things that all of us believe that are not going to be likely on any objective, you know, in any objective probability sense, conditional on the evidence we have. You know, we all believe it's rational to believe in the external world. This is not going to be likely given the acceptable evidence. Plantinga emphasized the importance of non-propositional evidence in determining what it's rational to believe, but the objective probabilities do not account for this. Without any principle linking these objective logical probabilities with what it's rational to believe, they aren't going to be of any use in the probability assumption. It would be really, really nice if we had some guaranteed method by which we could get everybody to agree on what the epistemically relevant probabilities were, but no such method exists. You know, given that the heart and our affections, our will, play a role in our judgments, we shouldn't expect us to agree on what the probabilities are. You know, we do agree on many things, but that's because the heart's not arbitrary. But there's areas in which our hearts and affections differ. And in many cases, when we disagree on probability judgments, it's not due to any defect in rationality of somebody. It's due to us having different hearts or affections. Okay, I want to now very briefly just talk about the problem of evil, and this is going to be just a cursory summary. And my main point here is I just want to show how different it looks if we reject the core assumption and the probability assumption. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to briefly look at the problem of evil with respect to austere theism, and then I'll look at how differently it looks if we reject the core assumption. Since it's commonly claimed that evil is evidence against, let's say, Christianity, what I'm going to do is use a modern theory of evidence to look at that issue. And I'm interested in whether a rational religious person should think that the facts about evil are evidence against his or her religious beliefs. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to argue that it's very difficult to formulate any plausible evidential argument from evil. And a rational religious person could actually hold that the problem of evil is a problem for naturalists. It's evidence against naturalism. So what I want to do is use likelihoodism to look at this. And likelihoodism is a major account of evidence in the philosophy of science literature. And it's actually very easy. According to likelihoodism, when we're comparing theories, you have evidence. If you want to use some evidence to compare theories, you just look at how likely the evidence is on the theories. So how likely is the evidence given this theory, and how likely is the evidence given another theory? It's called likelihoodism because the probability of evidence given a hypothesis are known as likelihoods. Well, on your handout, I put a principle that several likelihoods have endorsed. And it basically says evidence E is stronger evidence for hypothesis J over K if E is more likely on J than K. So if you have two hypotheses and you want to know, and you have some evidence and you want to know which one the evidence supports the most, it supports the one that it's most likely on. Now, likelihoodism, there's some aspects of it that are controversial. One advantage of it is that in judging evidential strength, you don't have to look at prior probabilities. So in our case, we wouldn't have to look at how likely it is initially that God exists or Christianity is true or naturalism or anything like that. It turns out, sort of interesting, that if we were to take more complicated accounts of evidence, It turns out that most of the Bayesian measures of evidential strength have exact